Hello, my name is Adam Miller. I'm the current TAC chair of the Linux Foundation AI and Data. What I want to talk to you today is kind of a discussion point that we've had inside the TAC recently about kind of our vision for the future, and a lot of this is led by some of the, the ongoing changes. We continue to talk about how rapidly everything's evolving and how, 3 months from now, everything we say today is going to be old and just kind of not necessarily valid anymore because of the rate of change. And with the history of the organization and how long it has existed and how much scientific rigor went into kind of the first wave of machine learning and current I guess generational leaps in the space of AI. In a lot of ways, kind of the foundation has not necessarily updated its future-looking view and its kind of focus, and some of this is kind of based around that and the proposal for where do we go from here. So first off, I want everybody to bear with me. If there is inconsistency in the design of my slides, it's because number one, I'm really bad at slides. And number two, I try to let AI make my slides look good and varying levels of success. So we'll see how it goes. So late last year and kind of this year is everything's agentic. This is the year of the agents. Agents are doing everything. OpenClaw is the most successful open source project of all times in various levels of adoption metrics and contribution metrics and various things. And it's one of the few times I've ever seen a project go from non-existence to existence to having people stand outside for hours at a time hoping to get into a user group session about it. It's just a fascinating thing to see us live through. So I want to very quickly read this. This is a kind of a mission statement type of a future-looking thing that I originally post a version of to the TAC. We discussed it, we iterated on it, and it is intentionally vague because the desire is to be inclusive, not inclusive, but the goal of where we want to go, how we want to focus our efforts, the type of projects we want to try to attract, and how we want to try to assemble ourselves, and then how do we go forward and support those open source technologies, and how do we bring this together as a foundation, and then also work across the aisle across to other foundations. So we want to, the current proposal on the board to the TAC, and we're not finalized this yet, so I would love feedback on this, but to establish a unified, open, vendor-neutral, production-ready infrastructure technology ecosystem on the Linux Foundation AI and Data to accelerate the development, deployment, governance, management, and interoperability of responsible AI systems, models, and data. And there's a number of vocabulary words in there that they were chosen on purpose. We wanted to make sure that we're focusing specifically on the systems themselves, the infrastructure that runs these things, the various technologies under the hood, the models themselves. How do we keep that in focus? How do we make sure that we're paying attention to the models, the openness of the models, how they interact with one another, how they interact with the system, and then the data component, because at the end of the day, data reigns supreme. Without the data, you don't build the models. Without the data, you don't build the workflows that you need to refine and fine-tune what you're trying to accomplish. So a lot of this talk is going to be kind of focused around and themed from this, statement here. And I would love to, either here or after or in the hallway or whatever, have some kind of discussion around this and get a little bit of feedback to better understand, does this go into alignment with what people are looking for, what the desires are out of the foundation, and kind of what we're trying to do. So we went through this AI assistant. You had ChatGPT, you have Gemini, you have Claude. You can pull it up in a web browser. You can ask it questions. You can copy and paste information back and forth from it and into it, and that was useful for a moment in time. And then at some point, we crossed over the gamut into the craze of agents, and we have the personal assistant agents, the OpenClaws, and similar clones of that technology. And then we have the autonomous agents and the desire to just let them run wild. If anybody watched Google I/O, it was all about agents and letting your phone have interactions with your calendar and your email and your Google Drive and your photos, and just it's the everything model. We're making world models, and there's a lot going on in this space. And then you have your coding agents. So we have your Claude, your Codex, your Gemini CLI, your OpenCode, your Hermes, your Goose, your Roo, your on down the line. There's so many of these. IBM Bob recently came out. There's a lot of stuff happening in this space, and the underlying like substrate of this is there are so many elements of the ecosystem that if you look at the current and the history of the AI space is like there's a congruency issue. We have the predictive AI, which is kind of these days considered legacy. In a lot of ways, it's lost focus, but it has not lost importance. The reality is like things like fraud detection still remain very valid, and we need to continue to support that. But we also need to kind of look forward to the future of where do we want to go as an organization, where do we want to focus our efforts, and try to bring more of this new kind of future-looking system into play. So kind of we're in a place where people are trying to apply a little bit of rigor, apply a little bit of interoperability, these kind of interfaces between these systems to allow us to collectively interact with one another, to find a way to construct systems that are interoperable. So we reach the protocol frontier. We find a place where we have these protocols that are trying to standardize ways in which that we compose these different things. MCP kind of started it. When we first got into agents, there were tool calls, and it's like, okay, well, I have to, every time I switch a framework, if I do LangChain, LangGraph, Crew AI, I have to like re-implement my tools or have all these different things. So MCP came out, and that solved that problem. That was very good, and that's very useful. But MCP is evolving, and there's things like MCP apps that are popping up. And then you have ACP, so Agent Client Protocol. You have the ability to interact with different agents over this other protocol, and that one's starting to kind of reach a certain level of maturity. You see it with Goose and how Goose can interact with other things like Cursor and Codex and Claude by virtue of ACP, and kind of like effectively farming out its back end to various things here. Then you have A to A, the ability for agents to interact with one another. There's a lot of kind of infrastructure technologies happening around that are popping up. But what's I think is fascinating about the protocols is at the end of the day is like a protocol is only as useful as the software that is built around it and the ecosystem that's built around it. MCP kind of caught lightning on a bottle, I think, by virtue of the craze of agents at the time, and when that happened, the tool calling, everybody's needs for what it offered. And now we're at this kind of next phase of like, okay, well, what next? And the concept of like multi-agent swarms is continuing to become like an increasingly popular idea. You see, you know, Steve Yegi's Gastown, now Gas City, and I'm sure there's like 5 other ones. There's a couple of different startups that have popped up around that. This idea of this like, you know, all-encompassing lights-out software factory where you just like you shove in inputs and out pops code and like magic happened in the middle. There's a lot of nuance to how does that work together? How do you actually build something like that in a meaningful, repeatable, and composable, and I mean, I guess auditable way? Because my goodness, if your lawyer is caught wind of just using Gastown to spit out software, good luck. So the question is like when you look at the protocols, what supporting software, what supporting infrastructure componentry do we need to make that useful in an enterprise environment, in a production-ready environment? So I think about the 4 pillars of autonomous infrastructure as governance, safety, orchestration, and connectivity. The reality is, from a governance perspective, you need the ability to do policy enforcement. You need the ability to express policy. You need the ability to audit whether or not the system in place is actually enforcing that policy. Can you prove systematically and programmatically that the thing that you've built and the thing that you're running is in fact complying with the policy you've put in place? And I know policy is everybody's like least favorite topic because admittedly it is boring. It is a component of like a necessity, not because like we woke up and we're all jazzed about, you know, policy enforcement. But again, you know, we live in a system where there are lawyers, and eventually they're going to come ask you questions, and you should probably be able to answer them. Safety means a lot of things to a lot of people. Sometimes it can be, you know, infosec security. Sometimes it can be, you know, physical safety when you get into various operational technologies. So assembly lines, when you get into robotics, there's a lot of things. But in general, there needs to be the ability to have a way to enforce and express safety in these systems. As we get to a point where, you know, the proposal is that these systems will make decisions for us. And when you talk about like robots, like your home home robot vacuums. We recently had a proposal of a project joining the Linux Foundation AI data that is hyper focused on kind of those home automation robots, like robot vacuums, Roombas and various clones of the Roomba idea. I'm not worried that it's going to run my foot over. But there was recently an article that came out from The Verge where they had a robot lawnmower, and they were able to actually have the lawnmower run a person over, and it's just that's bad. And so you get into this space of how do we do that? How do we do those types of topics? And then orchestration. So the juggernaut these days is Kubernetes, or when you're going to do production class orchestration, large deployment, Kubernetes is the way to go. From a perspective of data scientists and what I would consider kind of the AI systems flywheel of how do you do the development lifecycle of from data curation, features, data store, model training, post-training, tuning, hyperparameter tuning, whatever it is that you're doing to get to a point where it's okay, now I have a model, I have an inference endpoint, and then I'm going to write code to interface with that to then produce an application that is AI-enabled. There's a lot that has to go on there. There's a lot of components that happen there, and there's across the ecosystem. If you look at CNCF, if you look at PyTorch, if you look at AIF, if you look at various things that are industry specific, like Finos, the various things like that. There's a lot going on all over the place, and one of the desires I have for kind of where we go is how do we become the interconnected tissue to create something that brings it all together that we can collectively collaborate on and work with our partners in these other organizations. And then I kind of covered connectivity, I guess, just in my ramblings. So governance and data lineage. So we have a handful of projects, and I didn't name them all here, and I didn't exclude any by virtue of their lack of importance. These were just the first ones that came to mind as I kind of thought through the process of how do we compose this and how do we put these things together. And we have good examples of core technologies that are part of the foundation as it is today, and where do we want to go in the future, and how do we put those into a larger picture that is more interconnected. So governance and data lineage, we have a good foundation of where to start. We have a good, starting point for moving into the future of composing this into a larger system, or a set of larger systems, a set of blueprints, examples, various things. But in a very large way, I feel as though that we've not necessarily historically done a particularly good job of painting a larger picture of how our projects interconnect to each other to deliver a solution to a problem space, and then doing that, because very much in the way that a lot of open source projects do, there's a lot of desire for your thing to be all-encompassing, and that's very good. But if you look at kind of the history of open source, and then in the craze of microservices and 12-factor applications, all these things, all these trends, there's always this concept of kind of dating back to the original Unix philosophy of every component does one thing, it does it well, but it's also interconnectable and it is compatible in a way. And yes, I understand composing large multi-host systems, large distributed clusters is very different than I can just pipe from sed to grep, but the core kind of philosophy remains. Yeah. So behavioral safety and security. Responsible alignment, defensive shielding. This gets into an area that I'm recently become very passionate about. I'm working upstream on a project called OpenShell, and it's not currently part of Linux Foundation AI data, but it is, I think, an example of a building block that I consider a component for kind of moving to the future. And what it is basically is agent sandboxing, but it includes policy enforcement, and it includes audit trails, it includes various things like that. But this is, to me, it is an example of a type of technology that is kind of in line with how do you compose something that is useful on its own, but it is also a very good building block to a larger solution in a way that is integratable and becomes reusable in that way. So back to the note about Kubernetes, like when you think about like how do you build this in a very large way, well, you have various projects out there. You have Keta, you have Dapper, you have, in the context of non-human identity, Spiffy Inspire is trying to fill that gap, is like how do you have these agents run around, have an identity, have the ability to govern them with kind of delegated permissions within a limited context for what a human would otherwise do, but then have that be correlated to them as an identity to say, okay, me as a person, I have these 5 agents. Each of them is tasked with a specific thing, but I'm responsible for them. Because we're getting to a point where that is becoming a very real thing that organizations want of their employees, of their technology teams, is the ability to have a team of agents doing smaller, lower tasks as delegated on their behalf. So there's various technologies going there. And then there's a technology called Agentic, which is, this ties back into the A thing, and also ties into some of the agent sandboxing and various things there. But when I think about this, is like we have kind of a partner organization in the CNCF because we're all part of the Linux Foundation. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we all have to be in Linux Foundation to work together. Like the open source community at large doesn't necessarily care what foundation you do or don't belong to. The goal is to use our relationships to our benefit and find how do we as Linux Foundation AI and Data target the developer's laptop to make something useful so that they find benefit in what they're trying to do and that get them up to speed, but then also kind of reach out and work with our colleagues and our friends in the open source ecosystem and in the Linux Foundation over in the CNCF to say, okay, once you go from your laptop and you've done something interesting, how do you deploy that at scale in production? So I kind of defer to Kubernetes to have that problem solved, because in the very large way they have. They spent 10, 12 years doing that, and now they become an industry standard in the way that you deploy to production. So as I look at the open source projects that we have in Linux Foundation AI and Data, I would like us to kind of get to a posture to say the goal is to allow from single developer use case out to Kubernetes, and have each of the projects that we work with have kind of a story for how do you get from that I'm starting to do the crawl, walk, run. And the run being I'm deployed in production in Kubernetes, but the crawl being I have a laptop and I want to be able to do something useful. So secure execution layers, this goes back to kind of the OpenShell being an example. There's a handful of out there. Oh my gosh, Oh, I'm blanking. This is terrible. Anyways, there's a number of technologies I think are very interesting in this space that I think are worth exploring, kind of understanding how can we integrate with them to deliver the security and the sandboxing and the governance model at the agent layer. I think about this almost like an ice cream sandwich. Is like the agent is the ice cream in the middle. There's a piece of cookie or graham cracker on the bottom. There's a piece of cookie or graham cracker on the top. And the bottom part is kind of the agent sandbox, making sure the agent can't do things with permissions in the infrastructure, in the environment that it shouldn't. But the top layer is like, how do you prevent prompt injection and people trying to convince your software to do data exfiltration? And we can do some of that at the lower level because we can do network policy enforcement and things like that, and we can do server-side request forgery prevention and things like that. But there's so many elements of prompt injection that are just kind of left unaddressed to that. So that's another piece of the ice cream sandwich that I would like us to try to think about is like, okay, how do we inject on that top layer? How do we intercept those types of things and protect against those? And then, so you have memory and context, communication, execution, and discovery. You have various components of all of this of like, how do you work with these different interfaces into the system? How do you build out something, I think, that is more useful and enterprise ready and able to actually address what is needed for production in a way that is useful. So I have kind of a mapping of abstract needs to existing solutions and some things that I think are useful there. I'm open to opinions of how wrong I am about all this because I've had the good fortune of being in the open source community for over 25 years, and I constantly am a student. I am always open to the possibility that I'm wrong, and I love learning new things. So if you look at this and you're like, hey, I got an idea, great, let's hear it, let's do it. I also have no emotional attachment to any code I've written, so if you can look at something I've done and be like, that's bad. It's like, great, let's do it better. And I think about that in the same context of, as we look at what we want out of the foundation, how we want to move forward, I would love to make this collaborative and have more input and have people kind of help guide where we want to go. So as I map these kind of different verticals to there, and then the elephant in the room. There's the article published that 90% of AI projects never make it to production. It's like, well, some of the citations in there were about scaling problems and about how do you wire this up to your organization, how do you get it you hooked into your data systems, how do you do it in a way that is safe and secure and complies with the governance. And like, well, I'd like us to have an answer to that. I'd like us to realistically have a reference architecture, a solution. Maybe what we do is we use our projects combined with CNCF projects, combined with AIF projects, combined with FinOps projects, whatever, and then we create a reference architecture that is an implementation of the OPIA definition of the enterprise class AI architecture. There's so many different methods or different directions we can go with this that I think are useful. The question is just whether or not we do. So the pitch is, this is a cool visual. The AI just kind of was like, I got an idea. It's like, sure, go for it, bud. Basically, the core is, I would like for us to get to a point where we have better cross-organizational synergy with our colleagues and our partners in the Linux Foundation and then beyond, of how do we understand what is good? Because I think about like PyTorch Foundation is, if you're doing data science, you're doing model training, or you're doing things like that, like that's a great place to do that stuff. But I think a lot of what they're doing, a lot of what they've historically targeted is very academic in nature. It's not necessarily production workloads. And there's some nuance to that, and I understand that I'm probably wrong in some capacity of some of the projects they're working on, but a lot of their focus is around that space. Like they're targeting, VLLM and like the where inference meets the metal, where model training actually happens. I mean, the whole purpose of it originally, if I remember correctly, was because Meta wanted to be able to train some models internally, and doing it originally in Lua didn't work out, so they ported it to Python, and then it took off like wildfire, and here we are. And then like CNCF is they're battle tested at this point. They've built something very powerful, very global scale. And they're adapting very rapidly, but there are still, in my opinion, kind of blind spots of full integration of how kind of the area of what our projects specialize in, what they're trying to specialize in, don't necessarily align. And the AIF is like, they basically have three core technologies: MCP, the protocol itself, Agents.md, and then Goose. And I think Goose is very fascinating in a lot of ways, that open source project that I think could probably get more well integrated throughout the ecosystem. Everybody's supporting Agents.md, and MCP is kind of industry standard at this point. So I think there's an opportunity for us to become that connective tissue to kind of bring what each of these foundations very definitively focuses on into something more cohesive, and that would be kind of the goal there. So questions, comments, snide remarks, everything is welcome, and thank you for your time. So the question is about, is it recommendations, is it a blessed stack, or is it, what was the third one? Sorry, recommendations. Or like just some information. Here, why don't you take this? Yeah. Is this working? Yeah, okay. In a lot of ways, honestly, like, it's as much of a non-answer as it is like, I think it's all of it. I really, I think there need to be white papers that we publish that says, hey, here's what we did, here's an experimentation that we did, here's how we composed the system, here was the goals that we had, here are the criteria we measured it against, and this is what success looked like. And here's how you can build it yourself. And then that becomes reference architecture. And then we can rinse and repeat that for different problem spaces, because I don't think there's any one size fits all. When you talk about things like Gastown and these like lights out software factories, everybody's trying to build this. Everybody's chasing this magical future where this is a thing. The problem is, because every piece of software is not necessarily interchangeable with every other piece of software, the system you build around it to automatically iterate on it is unique to that specific domain space or that problem, and so I think that there is a large opportunity to actually build a series of reference architectures, a series of solutions, compose different open source projects in different ways to solve different problems. And what we need to do is we need to do the work and the research and the publications to say, here's what our goals were, here's the criteria that we considered success, here's what we measured, here's how we put it together, and here's how you can do it too. And here are our findings. And then just keep doing that. And then advertise it. Market the crud out of it. Be like, hey, here's how it's happening. Here's how the open source community is rising to the occasion. and surmounting the challenge. Thank you.